It all started on a bright Saturday morning in Cedar Ridge, a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Dallas. The sun was just beginning to shine through the trees, casting long shadows across the street. But the peaceful stillness of the morning was shattered by the sound of a truck pulling up. And not just any truck, mind you, but a big, shiny one with the bold letters HOA enforcement on the side. At the center of all this chaos was a woman named Karen. She'd lived in Cedar Ridge for over a decade, and if anyone knew the rules of the neighborhood, it was her. Karen was the HOA president, the self-proclaimed queen of the community. Her days were spent ensuring that everything in Cedar Ridge stayed neat, clean, and perfectly aligned with her version of perfection. And if you stepped out of line, well, you'd better believe she'd be the first to let you know. But it wasn't just about keeping things tidy for Karen, it was about control. Power. You see, the quiet, rural charm of Cedar Ridge didn't quite sit right with her. The sprawling lawns, the neighbors waving half-heartedly at each other, and the occasional distant sound of a tractor engine were all part of the life she wanted to keep far away from. But then came Hank. Hank McCoy was the kind of guy who didn't fit the typical Cedar Ridge mold. He wasn't from a big city, didn't wear fancy clothes, and didn't care much for the HOA's endless rules. He'd bought the property at the very edge of the neighborhood, just where the pavement ended and the fields began. His house was a bit of a fixer-upper, and at first, everyone thought he was just another guy moving in to retire in peace. But then he unloaded his trailer, and that's when everything changed. Out came chickens, goats, a couple of pigs, and of course the big old steer named Butterscotch. The neighbors had never seen anything like it. They were curious at first, especially the kids who couldn't get enough of the farm animals. Even Karen's husband, Bill, thought Hank wasn't all that bad. But Karen? Oh, she was furious. This is not a petting zoo. She snapped at the HOA meeting when someone dared to mention Hank's new animals. We have standards. Our property values depend on them. But Mr. Jenkins, who lived down the street, wasn't so sure. Hank's not hurting anyone, he argued. And technically, his land's on the outskirts, outside the jurisdiction of the HOA. Karen wasn't having any of it. No, she said, her voice rising. His land might be on the outskirts, but that barn? It's still part of Cedar Ridge, and that means it's under HOA control. She pointed to the bylaws like they were a holy book, and Hank was a sinner. But Hank didn't flinch. He just smiled and handed out jars of honey, homemade jam, and fresh eggs to anyone who'd take them. He wasn't about confrontation and just wanted a quiet life. But Karen couldn't let it go. She started her war in the shadows. She took photos of chicken feathers on the grass, recorded the turkey gobbling every morning at 6 a.m., and started building a case. It wasn't long before Hank received his first warning letter. Then a second. Then a third. Each time, he simply waved it off, smiling and offering eggs and jam, but Karen kept going. She even posted a petition around the neighborhood, trying to rally the troops. When that didn't work, she escalated. 3 times in 1 week, Karen called the police on Hank, accusing him of illegal animals and violations. The cops came, looked around, and each time, they left, shaking their heads. But that wasn't enough for Karen. Oh no. She called again. This time, she said it was a dangerous animal situation and a health hazard. That got their attention. The flashing lights, the sirens, they blared through the neighborhood like it was an emergency. By the time the cops arrived, Karen was standing in front of Hank's property, arms crossed, looking like she'd just won a battle. You need to do something about this, she told the officers, pointing at Hank's barn like it was a war zone. He's got dangerous animals. Cows, goats, chickens, even a turkey. A saw-gobbling saw turkey. It's disturbing the peace. The younger officer squinted. A turkey? Ma'am, is that really an emergency? Absolutely, Karen replied, nodding seriously. It gobbles at sunrise. 6 a.m., sharp. It's a nightmare. But Hank wasn't worried. He just leaned against his fence, arms crossed, completely unfazed. And then, with a sly smile, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out an envelope. You might want to take a look at this, he said, handing it to one of the officers. The officer opened the envelope, read a few lines, then glanced at Karen, his face slowly shifting from neutral to stunned. The other officer looked at him, confused. What's going on? We have a situation, the officer muttered. This changes everything. Karen's smug grin quickly faltered. That's when everything started to spiral out of control. You see, it wasn't just any document that Hank had handed over. It was the kind of legal paperwork that would make Karen's clipboard crumble into dust. The sheriff, who had been quietly observing from his patrol car, stepped out, and as soon as Hank saw him, his face lit up. "Hank McCoy," the sheriff said with a warm grin, tipping his cowboy hat. Well, I didn't expect to see you here, but it's good to see you've settled down." Karen blinked in confusion. "You two know each other?" she asked, her voice tinged with panic. The sheriff chuckled. "Hank saved my life back in '98 during the Bastrop wildfires. If he says his land's zoned for agriculture, it is. No one knows that paperwork better than him." Karen's face turned beet red. "You've been harassing this man over nothing saw," the sheriff continued, turning his attention to her. "And I'm gonna need you to stop calling the cops with false reports, or we'll have to escalate things." That's when Karen's face dropped, her clipboard trembling in her hands. But the story wasn't over. The very next morning, something strange happened. Karen woke up to a shrill scream coming from her front yard. At first, she thought it was just another morning bird, but no, it was a scream that didn't sound like anything she'd heard before. It was Karen herself, shrieking in panic. The goats had somehow made their way into her yard, eating her rose bushes and even nibbling on her precious welcome mat that said HOA strong. As Karen tried to shoo them away, one of the goats dropped a huge, "Well, you get the picture." "Your goats," Karen screamed, pointing down the street. "They're attacking me." But Hank wasn't angry. He just walked down the road, coffee mug in hand, looking as calm as ever. "Well, that's a new one," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. But things were about to get even worse for Karen, because Hank had installed security cameras around his barn just in case of situations like this. And as Hank pulled up his phone, everyone gathered around him in silence. The footage clearly showed Karen sneaking into his barn at 4 a.m., cutting the latch to the goat pen. She didn't realize Hank had installed cameras. She didn't realize he had proof. And the sheriff, well, he wasn't laughing anymore. "Karen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we've got ourselves a case of criminal trespassing. You've tampered with his property, and it's a crime." Karen's face drained of color. Her body stiffened, and for the first time, the Queen of Cedar Ridge realized she wasn't as untouchable as she thought. And just when she thought things couldn't get worse, they did. The next day, when Karen was holed up in her house, the whole neighborhood gathered at the emergency HOA meeting. Hank didn't show up with anger or vengeance. He showed up with a proposal. He wanted to turn his property into a community farm, a place where kids could learn about animals, where neighbors could come together for food-sharing programs, and where his farm could be a peaceful retreat for the neighborhood. Karen thought she'd have the upper hand at the meeting, but the vote came back 87 fan-tram in Hank's favor. She lost. And the HOA? Well, it would never be the same again. As Hank stood on his porch that evening, looking out at the property he loved, the neighbors who once saw him as an outsider were now helping him rebuild. But Karen? She was gone, her VY sore left behind, a symbol of her defeat. And Hank? He didn't want revenge. He didn't want war. He just wanted peace. So Cedar Ridge learned a valuable lesson that day sometimes. The biggest VY Tory doesn't come from winning a fight. It comes from VYing it with grace. What do you think, folks? Was Karen right to fight so hard for the HOA rules? Or was Hank's way the better path? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. This script is designed to capture the humor, drama, and emotional depth of the story while maintaining a conversational tone that feels like a personal recounting. It introduces the characters, builds the conflict, leads to a satisfying resolution, and ends with a call to action to drive engagement.